Looking for a good way to eat a sweet treat every day that could also add years to your life and reduce your risk for disease? Well, enter chocolate. But unfortunately, it's not every chocolate. Obviously, Reese's and Hershey's are not doing you any favors. But interestingly, it's not even every dark chocolate that can provide these longevity benefits. And I think after you watch this video, you'll be pretty amazed at just how much goes into selecting a chocolate that will actually give you longevity benefit instead of harm. So today, we're discussing all of the studied scientific benefits that the correct chocolate could provide. We're covering the mechanisms as to how it does so, and then we're diving deep into how to select a chocolate with the highest amount of positive bioactives and the lowest amount of contaminants such as heavy metals. Let's jump in first with the benefits. Maybe most impressively, in a very large meta-analysis of cohort studies, the group of people that consumed the most chocolate on a daily basis had a 12% lower risk of all causes of death compared to the group of people who had the lowest amount of chocolate intake. And the same study noted that, again, the group with the highest chocolate intake had a 13% lower risk of death due to cardiovascular disease and a 12% lower risk of death due to cancer. And then outside of just inhibiting death from multiple diseases, chocolate intake has also been associated with a lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease in the first place. For instance, in a meta-analysis of multiple randomized controlled trials, optimal dark chocolate intake, which we'll talk about what that means later, was associated with an 11% lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And this is likely due to its effect at lowering multiple risk factors for cardiovascular disease. One specific study noted that dark chocolate intake was associated with lowering an LDL cholesterol by about 10 points, lowering a fasting blood sugar by about 5 points, and lowering blood pressure by 2 to 3 points. Furthermore, chocolate has also been associated with positive effects in the brain as well. For instance, one study noted that increased chocolate intake was associated with a 41% decreased risk of cognitive decline with aging. And then another study, a meta-analysis looking at multiple randomized controlled trials, demonstrated that chocolate intake was associated with improved markers of memory, learning, and attention. And finally, a different meta-analysis noted that chocolate was associated with a positive effect on mood in the short term. And finally, chocolate also has studied benefit in the gut as well. Although there's less studies here, there was one randomized controlled trial, for instance, in athletes that noted that chocolate intake was associated with a lower level of gut permeability. So those are some pretty wide-reaching effects: lowering risk of death from all causes, lowering cardiovascular disease risk, improving cognitive performance, improving gut health, etc. But what is the mechanism as to how chocolate provides all these benefits? Because understanding the mechanism actually allows us to know what to look for in a chocolate to give us all these longevity benefits. So to understand the mechanism behind chocolate's benefits, you have to understand what is the beneficial part of chocolate, and that is the cocoa, or more specifically, the non-fat cocoa solids. This portion of the chocolate has a ton of positive bioactives that give chocolate all its benefits that we just talked about. And probably most importantly amongst all these bioactives are flavonoids, which are a subgroup of polyphenols, those plant-based anti-inflammatories and antioxidants. Specifically, the non-fat cocoa solids have a ton of these specific flavonoids: epicatechin, catechin, and procyanidins. And outside of their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, which of course contribute to all of those positive effects we just mentioned, these specific flavonoids are also known for their ability to promote positive vascular health. Specifically, these flavonoids are great at increasing nitric oxide, which is super important for blood vessel dilation and many other aspects of vascular health, hence the positive blood pressure effect of chocolate. And these specific flavonoids in cocoa are also great at blood sugar regulation and insulin sensitivity, again, hence the further lowering of cardiovascular disease risk. And in addition, these flavonoids, the epicatechin, the catechin, the procyanidins, also have a great neuroprotective effect and improve blood flow to the brain. These things helping with that cognitive performance and that ability to decrease cognitive decline. And finally, these flavonoids also have a prebiotic action, essentially providing food for the good bacteria in your gut to flourish them and promote gut health. So you can probably see how all of these flavonoids are the main mechanism as to how chocolate gets all of those longevity benefits. But that non-fat cocoa solids portion of chocolate contains additional bioactives that further contribute to its longevity benefit. Specifically, one thing it contains are additional vitamins and minerals. So think magnesium, zinc, iron, all in relatively high concentrations in that non-fat cocoa solid portion of the chocolate. And additionally, in that same portion of the chocolate, there are also higher concentrations of methylxanthines, specifically caffeine and theobromine. And theobromine specifically is able to slightly lower cholesterol levels and have positive impact on blood vessel dilation, which obviously improves that cardiovascular effect of chocolate. And the methylxanthines as a whole also promote chocolate's brain effects, that improving the cognitive performance, improving mood, etc. So you can probably now guess what we need to do to maximize chocolate's longevity benefit. And that is maximize all of those positive bioactives, the methylxanthines, the minerals, and most importantly, the flavonoids. And then you can also probably guess what we need to minimize from the chocolate to get the most longevity benefit. And that is minimizing the extra added sugars, fats, and of course the contaminants. But how do we do this? Well, every single step of chocolate creation, all the way from planting the cacao tree, all the way to the commercial packaging and shipping, influences how much of those positive bioactives survive and influences how much of the sugar, the fat, and the contaminants are added in. So we're going to walk through basically every single step of chocolate creation and talk about how to maximize the bioactives and minimize the bad things at every step, so you know exactly what to look for when you're selecting a chocolate for longevity purposes. So the first step of chocolate creation, which obviously has an impact on the amount of flavonoids and the rest of the bioactives, is the cultivation of cacao. Essentially, the planting, growing, and managing of the cacao tree, which produces cacao pods, and inside of those are the beans from which the cocoa comes from. Now, this step starts with selecting the variety, or essentially the type of cacao tree. And there are three main types you'll see. There's Criollo, there's Forastero, and there's Trinitario. And this has only a minor impact on the polyphenol or the flavonoid content, but an impact nonetheless. The Criollo variety is the rarest form, and it also has the most flavonoids, about 7% more than the next highest, which is the Forastero, which has 25% more than the lowest, Trinitario. And then where you plant that variety also matters, with studies demonstrating that cacao planted in the Americas has a 16% higher flavonoid content than cacao planted in Africa. Then in regards to how you grow that cacao, does it matter if it was grown conventionally versus organic? Well, there's less studies here, but in one study we do have, they found that there was no difference in the amount of bioactives or flavonoids in organic versus conventionally grown cacao. That being said, conventionally grown cacao obviously could have pesticide residue in it, which could be detrimental to health depending on the concentrations. So I like a chocolate that's been produced from organically grown cacao. However, it's not an absolute must if you're trying to cut cost, due to the fact that the bioactive levels are not much different between conventionally and organically grown. And then even another consideration when it comes to how the cacao is grown is, was it shade grown or grown in full sun conditions? If it was shade grown, you're going to get 20 to 30% higher bioactives. So this is actually a pretty important thing to consider. However, it's often difficult to determine whether your chocolate was made from cacao that was grown in a shade grown manner or in the full sun. So one little cheat code here is to know that the full sun conditions promote higher yield. So larger corporations are often going to use cacao that comes from this full sun production method, versus the smaller bean to bar producers are often using smaller farms, which get less yield, but use this shade grown technique to promote further bioactives and promote better flavor compounds. So this is actually a pretty common theme as we move forward in the chocolate production process. And that is that smaller chocolate producers and smaller farms often use methods that are better for preserving bioactives compared to the larger corporations. And we'll continue to point this out along the way. Then after growing the cacao, you obviously have to harvest it. And when you harvest it really matters for the amount of bioactives that are in the cacao. And this is because as the cacao pods mature, they develop more and more flavonoids and more methylxanthines and minerals. So if you harvest the cacao at peak maturity, you're actually going to get 70% more of all those bioactives. And in addition, harvesting at the correct time at that peak maturity is also going to improve taste quality as well. So again, you can think here, these smaller producers that are more focused on quality over quantity are going to give you not only maybe a bar that tastes better, but definitely a bar that has much higher polyphenols. Then the next step is, after you take the cacao pod off of the tree, you open it up, take the beans and the pulp surrounding them out, and then the fermentation process begins. And essentially what's happening here is the natural yeast and bacteria are converting the pulp and other components into positive flavor precursors that will give chocolate its complex flavor down the road. However, the bad part here is that the longer the fermentation process, the less bioactives that will remain. And studies have demonstrated that a 3-day or 72-hour fermentation process results in 40% higher bioactive yield compared to longer fermentation process. So if you can find a chocolate that lists their fermentation time, and seeing that it's closer to 3 days would be beneficial compared to a longer 7-day, for instance, fermentation. Then after the fermentation process, the beans must be dried, which is a process which again will really lower the amount of bioactives in the cacao. However, using a more gentle, natural drying method, such as just using the sun, can really help inhibit the lowering of all those bioactives, compared to when you use a more artificial, mechanical drying method, which will really lower the bioactives. And you might have guessed it, the smaller producers are more likely going to be using this sun-dry method, so yet another reason to go with a smaller chocolate producer. Then after drying, the beans are then roasted to further develop the flavor profile. However, high heats here can super degrade the amount of polyphenols and the rest of the bioactives. If it's high enough heat, all of the polyphenols can be degraded here. So you really want to find a chocolate that was produced with a more gentle roasting method, if it was roasted at all, to preserve a lot of these polyphenols. And yet again, the smaller producers are more likely to be doing this. After roasting, the cacao beans are cracked open to remove the edible portion, or the nibs. And those nibs can be purchased separately and will contain a relatively high polyphenol content. But for chocolate, the nibs are then ground into a liquid known as chocolate liqueur, which contains two main components. One, the cocoa butter, and two, the non-fat cocoa solids, like we mentioned earlier, that has all those positive bioactives. And with the nibs, or with the chocolate liqueur, the next step that is optional but can be done, and it's super detrimental when it is Dutching or alkalinization. Essentially, this step is to remove some of the acidity of chocolate to make it less bitter. However, when it's done, it significantly lowers the amount of polyphenols. Specifically, studies have noted that this Dutching or alkalinization process can lower flavonoid content by 80 to 98%. So you really want to make sure that you're getting chocolate that is non-Dutched or non-alkalinized to preserve much more polyphenols. And a good way to make sure you're getting non-Dutch chocolate is yet again to buy from a smaller producer who are much less likely to be Dutching their chocolate. But regardless of whether this Dutching or alkalinization process is used, the next step for the chocolate liqueur to go through is the refining process. And this is where all those not so helpful ingredients get added in, i.e. the unhealthy fats and the sugars. So if you take the chocolate liqueur and you add in milk and extra added sugars, that's when you're going to be diluting all of the positive beneficial compounds in the chocolate liqueur, and you're also adding in, obviously, the unhelpful fats and sugars. And that is milk chocolate. Now, if you take just the cocoa butter part of the chocolate liqueur and basically you get rid of the non-fat cocoa solids where we have all of the positive active components. If you just use the cocoa butter and you use milk and sugar added onto that, you get the least beneficial type of chocolate, and that is white chocolate. And then finally, if you just use the chocolate liqueur with maybe a little bit of added sugars in, that's when you get dark chocolate. And that's what we're focusing on from here on out. And this refining phase is really where you determine the percentage of cacao in the chocolate. And that's just essentially how much of the chocolate mixture is from the helpful chocolate liqueur and how much of the mixture is from the added milk, sugar, fats, etc. So how high of a percentage of cacao do we need in a chocolate bar to give us all the longevity benefits that we mentioned? Well, most randomized controlled trials that are using chocolate as an intervention use dark chocolate that is 70% cacao or higher. So I would make sure you're getting at least that high. And from there, it really just kind of depends on taste and palatability for you specifically. Obviously, the higher up we go, all the way up to 100%, the more bioactives we're going to have, the more flavonoids, methylxanthines, minerals, etc., and the less added sugars. So 100% is obviously the best. However, if you really can't eat that from a taste perspective because it's too bitter, then maybe start with 70%, which is what I'd recommend almost everyone do, and work your way up. And you might find that over time you develop more of a taste for the higher percentage cacao chocolates. But once you do have your defined chocolate mixture with the chocolate liqueur and any added ingredients, the chocolate then goes through a conching process, or essentially a prolonged mixing process to further refine the texture and flavor. However, here again, high heat and prolonged conching times can further drive down all the bioactives by up to 20 to 30%, the studies note. And yet again, the smaller producers are more likely to be using a more gentle, shorter conching period, thus another reason yet again to go with them. Then after conching, the chocolate mixture is cooled in a controlled manner and then molded into shape and packaged. And these processes have a little bit less impact on all the bioactives, but what does really matter is how quickly you eat the chocolate bar after it's produced and packaged. Studies demonstrate that 50 to 80% of the polyphenols and other bioactives can be degraded over an 18-month period of chocolate storage. So it's important to eat the chocolate soon after buying or creating it. And outside of just eating it sooner, storing the chocolate in a colder, darker place can also help preserve the polyphenols as well. In regards to what it's packaged in, I do slightly prefer non-plastic packaging as it inhibits the risk of plastic-based contaminants from migrating into the chocolate. However, this is a minor concern, especially compared to the other contaminants I'm more concerned about with chocolate. Probably the most concerning potential contaminant in chocolate are heavy metals, especially lead and cadmium. And these get into the chocolate mostly from the cultivation stage due to contaminated soil. In dark chocolates and higher cacao percentages are associated with higher heavy metal loads compared to milk chocolates or lower cacao percentages. And studies have noted that 35 to 43% of dark chocolates contain harmful levels of heavy metals. And since we are looking for these dark chocolates in the high cacao percentages, this is a contaminant we really need to be on the lookout for. Because as we've mentioned on the channel previously, heavy metals contribute to oxidative stress over the long term and thus contribute to chronic disease. So I'd really recommend finding a chocolate bar that has been tested for and has low levels of these heavy metals, especially lead and cadmium. The next contaminant to be worried about are mold and mycotoxins, essentially the toxins that are created from mold. And this is the second largest group of contaminants to be worried about in chocolate. And studies have noted that up to 30% of chocolates that they tested contained ochratoxin A, or one of the toxins that molds produce. And this mold and mycotoxins can be entered into the chocolate at multiple different stages of the chocolate's processing. And unfortunately, testing for the mold and mycotoxins is done even more rarely than heavy metal testing. So what's important here is to find a company that you trust in regards to, is it actually going through rigorous quality and production control. Doing this and also finding a bar that's tested for heavy metals, using non-plastic processing, and getting organic chocolate that is pesticide free is going to be the highest level of contaminant avoidance. So overall, there are obviously a lot of factors to look for in a chocolate bar when you are trying to eat chocolate for longevity, and it goes way beyond just the cacao percentage. For example, if you had a 100% cacao bar that was fermented too long, roasted at high temperatures, conched for a long time, and Dutched, you're going to have 100% cacao, but you're going to have very limited amount of polyphenols and the positive bioactives that are giving chocolate all its benefits. Compare that to if you had a 70% cacao chocolate bar, but it was fermented for the right time, harvested at optimal time, shade grown, lightly roasted, and non-Dutched. Then you're going to have a bar with a ton of polyphenols despite only having 70% cacao percentage. Now, I'll say up front, it's nearly impossible to find a brand that is doing all of the things that we just listed perfectly while also testing for heavy metals, testing for other contaminants, and all offering a chocolate at a fair price. And to make it even trickier, most brands are not just telling you every single step of their processing and telling you that we fermented it for this long and roasted it at this temperature, etc. So with what they do give us, we really have to look at the big picture. Their sourcing, their quality control, their farming methods that they do note, and their scale, all to select a brand that we believe is going to promote the highest polyphenol content and the highest bioactive content in general. And for me, what that starts with is looking for a brand that has some heavy metal testing. There are probably plenty of small bean-to-bar producers which are really, really good at preserving bioactives. However, if they don't have any heavy metal data, then I'm staying away from them currently. However, if you know of a small bean-to-bar producer that does test for heavy metals, drop them in the comments below. But then at the same time, I'm avoiding the large industrial brands, think the Ghirardellis of the world, because they're generally more focused on yield compared to doing all the little things right that can optimize bioactives. So we're looking for a great balance for a brand between tested for heavy metals and large enough to be testing, but also not too large to be getting rid of all the bioactives. And then we look at that level of company and we say, what are your production methods that you are telling us, and how do those production methods actually optimize for polyphenols? And with all of that, I've selected 5 brands that I think are great at optimizing polyphenol content while also testing for heavy metals to some extent. So first up, and these are in no specific order, is Taza. And Taza is a great small bean-to-bar company that really shines in the minimal amount of processing they do on their chocolate. For instance, they use a light roast, which promotes, obviously, those bioactives. And they also use a stone grinding process, which is gentler on the cacao and, again, will further promote bioactives. And they do all of this on organically grown, high-quality cacao from farms that follow a lot of the cultivation steps that we mentioned earlier. And on top of all of this, Taza is one of the brands tested by Consumer Reports to have the lowest level of heavy metals, specifically containing about 7 micrograms per kilogram of lead and 105 micrograms per kilogram of cadmium, which in the case of lead is a similar amount to what you would find in any random fruit or vegetable. And for cadmium is on the high end of what you would find in produce, but is similar to the amount of cadmium you'd find in spinach, for instance. So for this brand and for the rest of them, you'll see it's very difficult, if not impossible right now, to get heavy metals to 0. But we can get them to a low enough level that it's similar to ingesting other produce. So overall, Taza is a great pick for optimizing polyphenol content while still having pretty good heavy metal testing data. Next up is Mast. And Mast is the king when it comes to the US for low heavy metals. When it was tested by Consumer Report, it had the lowest heavy metals across all the chocolates and was found to have lead at only 2.5 micrograms per kilogram and cadmium at 58 micrograms per kilogram. On top of that, they're another smaller bean-to-bar producer and is certified organic using sustainable farming practices, which again align with helping improve those bioactive concentrations. That being said, they don't tell us as much about their processing and their methods as Taza does. So to me, I would think this one probably has slightly less polyphenol content than does Taza, who is really optimizing the minimal processing. However, I still think this one has a good amount of polyphenols and even better when it comes to lowering your contaminant risk. Next up is Raka. And Raka is similar to Taza in how explicit it goes into its processing and its methods of chocolate creation, and they do great at minimally processing their bar and doing a lot of the things that we mentioned right in it when it comes to optimizing polyphenol content. Specifically, Raka does one thing that's super impressive in regards to maximizing flavonoids, and that is it doesn't roast the beans at all, which will significantly increase the polyphenol content. And similar to Taza, they're very transparent in regards to where they get their beans from organically certified farms who use great practices, which will again further optimize those bioactive contents. And they also internally test for heavy metals and post their results online. So while the heavy metal testing is not as impressive as Taza and Mast, which were third-party tested, I still think this one is a good option for lowering contaminants compared to many other chocolates on the market, and probably is the best for optimizing those bioactives. Next up, and your last US-based company, is Spring and Mulberry. And Spring and Mulberry does internal testing for heavy metals and reported super low metal loads, specifically for lead, 4 micrograms per kilogram, and a very impressive only 19 micrograms per kilogram for cadmium. Again, this is not third-party testing, so not as impressive to me as Taza or Mast, but still impressive nonetheless. Outside of this, they use organically farmed cacao beans, and from what I can tell, probably do pretty well in regards to maintaining bioactive concentrations through their processing and farming methods. However, they're not near as explicit as a Taza or a Raka, so in my mind, they probably have less bioactives than those two, but still good heavy metal data. And a positive for this one is instead of using just regular old sugar to sweeten their bars, they use dates, which has a lower glycemic index and gives you a little bit of extra fiber. So I think with that, the good heavy metal data, and the probably pretty good polyphenol content, Spring and Mulberry could be a great choice. And finally for chocolate bars is Nordcode. And this is your go-to if you live in the EU, UK, or Switzerland. They are unique in all of the bars on this list as they only use cacao sourced in the Americas, which we talked about having a higher polyphenol content. They also use the Criollo variety, which also has the highest flavonoid content. Outside of this, they also boast minimal processing, including no roasting, to further enhance the bioactive compounds. And they even test their bars to make sure they have enough polyphenols in them, which is super impressive, and I can't really find any that do this in America. And on top of all of that, they also internally test for heavy metals and mycotoxins. Granted, I couldn't find their published test data on this. But regardless, a super high bioactive concentration in this one, and if I could just find their published data, this one could be the best of the best, but it's definitely my go-to for Europe. And finally, a bonus one for cocoa powders if you want to go that route, to include it in baked goods or smoothies, etc. And for cocoa powders, essentially how they're created is you just take out the cocoa butter part of that chocolate liqueur, and now you're really only left with the non-fat cocoa solids, the beneficial part in a powder form. And an important thing to note here before I give you the brand is if you are using the cocoa powder in baking, make sure to bake it at as low of temps as possible and to use baking powder instead of baking soda to keep that pH low and preserve all of the bioactives that you can. But for the brand here, I like to go with Santa Barbara chocolate. They have a cocoa powder called Cocoa Dynamics, which they even test their polyphenol content to demonstrate there's a high amount of bioactives in this one. And they also test for heavy metals in the cocoa powder, which are still relatively low, but I will say their cadmium is higher than the bars that we mentioned, almost double the amount from the other bars we talked about. So for this one, it's really important to stick with the serving size to limit cadmium exposure over time, while also still getting the good bioactives from this cocoa powder. And truthfully, that sentiment holds true for whatever form of chocolate you're getting, because it's all about moderation when it comes to eating this chocolate for longevity and cognitive benefit. But what is moderation? How much chocolate should you have to optimize your longevity benefit? Well, in the study we mentioned at the beginning, talking about how chocolate lowers the risk of all causes of death, the group that had the largest amount of chocolate intake had the lowest risk of death compared to all the groups that were having less chocolate intake. And that group that had the largest amount of chocolate intake, that was defined as about 12.4 grams per day of chocolate. And then in the Women's Health Initiative study, they noted that the group that was eating 1 to 3 servings of chocolate per day, and a serving was defined here as 28 grams, that group had the lowest risk of death from all causes and death from cardiovascular disease and dementia. And 1 to 3 servings per week of 28 grams per serving basically amounts to 4 to 12 grams per day. And then if you look at the randomized controlled trials looking at chocolate's impact on cardiovascular disease, they used anywhere between 2 and 50 grams of a high quality chocolate per day. And probably the most common dose was 10 grams of that chocolate per day. So based on all of that population data and the randomized controlled trial data, I would stick with that number we kept seeing, that 10 grams of dark chocolate per day of 70% cocoa or more. That will allow you to still get a ton of flavonoids, methylxanthines, and minerals while still limiting your contaminants, sugars, and fats. And then if you're gonna go with cocoa powder, I would stick with about 5 grams per day. And finally, does it matter when you eat that 10 grams of chocolate per day? Well, there's less studies on this, but the studies we do have point to eating chocolate in the morning giving a little bit more benefit than eating it in the evening. For instance, one randomized control trial demonstrated that morning chocolate intake compared to evening chocolate intake resulted in improved fasting blood sugar, lower waist circumference, and improved fat oxidation. Furthermore, there has been additional studies that look at chocolate's positive impact on the circadian rhythm when you take it in the morning. And due to the caffeine content in dark chocolate, it would make sense that taking it in the morning when your body can fully metabolize out the caffeine would be more beneficial so that caffeine doesn't impact your sleep at all. So ideally, you're eating that 10 grams of chocolate at breakfast time. Now I want to learn about 5 more foods that have even more longevity benefit. Check out this video here.